Hello, this is a re-recording of a presentation on quicker, safer tsunami evacuations that was originally given at Napier Boys High School on the 19th of March. I'm going to start with a little bit of a recap of the processes that cause the largest tsunamis. So the world is covered on its surface with a series of different tectonic plates that are moving relative to one another. Where the plates are coming towards each other, we have this situation called subduction, where one plate is getting pushed down beneath another. Now, sometimes this process can occur smoothly, and the incoming plate just passes by underneath the overriding plate. But sometimes the plates become stuck together. And when one plate gets stuck to another, the upper plate starts to change shape as it is getting bent out of shape. This stores up elastic energy, and at a certain point, the stored energy is too much, and plate springs back to close to its original shape. And with this plate bringing back, we get a big earthquake, and with that big earthquake, the seabed changes shape. In this case, lifts up, and here it's lifting up the water above it. And that raised up water, it becomes the start of tsunamis. And the waves then spread out, with one part of the wave is heading offshore and another part is heading towards the coast. In the context of New Zealand, we have such a boundary between tectonic plates that's running through the country. We have the Australian plate on one side and the Pacific plate on the other. On the east coast of the North Island, the Pacific plate is subducting beneath the Australian plate, whereas the plate boundary passes through the South Island along the Alpine Fault, where the two plates are basically sliding past each other in the horizontal plane, and we revert to subduction down to the south of the South Island, except in this case, it's the Australian plate that is passing beneath the Pacific. So we have this process which tends to cause the largest earthquakes and the largest tsunamis taking place off the east coast of the North Island, and so this is the number one tsunami concern for Hawke's Bay. We can look into the geology around the North Island and look for evidence of past large earthquakes and tsunamis. The geology, we're looking for evidence of the sort of change in vertical subsidence or raising of the coastline that accompanies these big earthquakes. And we can also look more directly for evidence of past tsunamis in places like the Ahuriri Lagoon. In this way, we found evidence for approximately 10 of these large earthquakes over the last 7,000 years. The ones in orangey red are ones we're more confident about. So there are 6 we're confident about, and a further 4 here that we're not quite so sure about. But this gives some feeling for rough frequency with which these kind of events take place. In addition to the plate boundary itself, there are also a number of faults running through the upper plate. And earthquakes on these upper plate faults could, in some cases, also produce a tsunami, although we don't expect them to produce such a large tsunami as comes from the plate boundary itself. Of particular note for Hawke's Bay are the faults that run, roughly speaking, between Mahia and Cape Kidnappers. Some of these faults, like Lachlan Fault, could potentially have earthquakes large enough to produce a tsunami. One of the key differences is that such a tsunami, although it's likely to be smaller than one from the plate boundary, could also arrive more quickly. So where we're talking about 30 to 40 minutes for a tsunami to reach Napier from the plate boundary, we're talking potentially 15 to 20 minutes for it to reach Napier from one of these plate faults, like the Lachlan fault. So this has some implications for our evacuation. So a little bit more context. So we're looking into self-evacuations that follow a long or strong earthquake from a nearby fault. And the biggest threat comes from earthquakes on the plate boundary offshore of Hawke's Bay. And our models suggest about 30 or 40 minutes for the main waves to start inundating the coast after a plate boundary quake. But smaller waves may arrive sooner, especially if other faults are involved. So we could have a plate boundary earthquake that also has movement on some of those offshore faults, where we might get a tsunami, a smaller part of the tsunami that arrives in about 15 to 20 minutes. We could also have the situation where just the plate fault has an earthquake of its own. The implications of this are, although for most parts around Napier, our target is to be evacuated in 30 or 40 minutes, particularly around the lower lying areas around the river mouths, we would really like to be people out of those areas in 15 to 20 minutes before those smaller waves arrive. Here's a map of the tsunami evacuation zone from the Hawke's Bay Emergency Management website. So this is the area where if you are in there and you feel a long or strong earthquake, that's your signal to try and leave the shaded areas to get out of the tsunami evacuation. So I'm shortly going to show some computer simulations of what might happen during a tsunami evacuation. But remember, an actual evacuation can be a very complicated thing, and real life will not exactly match what's in these models. We realize there are some aspects that are unrealistic, but hopefully they're still helpful for us when it comes to thinking about evacuations. And official information on what you should do will be provided by Hawke's Bay Civil. So coming to our models, when I show the animations, we're going to see the movement of simulated people on foot. They will leave their houses and their workplaces and will try and get to the tsunami evacuation zone as quickly as possible. And so you'll see a blue line on the map, which is the boundary for the safe area. You'll see red dots appear, which represent individual simulated people, often called agents. The simulated people start off as red dots. In situations where they're slowed down because of overcrowding, they change color to purple. And we've made every 100th agent a white dot. That's just to make it a little bit easier to count the numbers of agents. So here's our first example, and this is going to be showing the evacuation in the central part of Napier, which is assumed to be taking place in daytime. And by daytime, I really mean in working hours. So I'll just start the animation playing. So here we have the time since the earthquake, and it takes a little bit of time for people to leave their houses or workplaces and start traveling towards the safe areas. Because this is daytime, we have a lot more people in the town center than we have night or outside working hours. Conversely, we tend to have fewer people in urban areas. So one of the things we see from this model is that we could expect quite a lot of people from the central part of town to be heading up towards Napier Hill. We also see the agents from West Shore coming across the Pandora Road Bridge to try to get to high ground. Now, this isn't ideal because the Pandora Road Bridge is crossing River Mall, where there is a risk of being affected by those earlier waves. It's also a fairly low, not very high above the water level. So there is a definite question, is it the right thing for people in West Shore to be heading across this bridge if they're not going to be able to get across it in the first 15 to 20 minutes. Notice that in our models, the agents always from West Shore always choose to use the Pandora Road Bridge rather than the bicycle bridge or the highway bridge. This is because they're trying to use the shortest possible route. But in practice, it may make more sense for people from the northern part of West Shore to use these other bridges because although it's further to go, those are higher is above the waterline. There is a question, is the model realistic in that respect? And would it make more sense for people to use those bridges? Here we're doing the same thing for the southern part of Napier. Now, because this is daytime, we have people at their workplaces, and in these semi-rural parts of Napier, where it's farmland or vineyards or similar activities, the number of people working here is not great. So in practice, although in the urban parts of town, we strongly encourage people to go by foot, because that leaves some room on the road for those who really have no chance to go by foot, like disabled or elderly people. These semi-rural parts, their numbers are not so great that it's probably okay if people were to use their cars, because there's not so many people that it's likely to cause a traffic jam. Paying attention now to the fertilizer factory area, the workers from the fertilizer factory have to travel quite a long way, first along parallel to the coast before they can start coming inland, which is obviously not ideal. They're sort of going sides of a square. So it'd be interesting to look whether there may be the possibility of some other routes across, more direct from the fertilizer factory to the safe areas. Another thing that could be looked into is whether if there was some kind of arrangement where there was car sharing, so that instead of each person from the factory getting into their own car, which would put a lot of cars onto the road and risk causing congestion. If we had, for instance, 5 people to a car, then perhaps numbers or the number of vehicles would not be so great, but it would get people just as quickly to safety. So that's something that could be looked into. The issue is in this part of town, there are quite a few proposals for new development. And although the distance from these areas to the safe zone is not very large, there's actually relatively few places where people can, at the moment, can get across the new developments into the safe areas. And that's something that could also be looked at to facilitate evacuations once the number of people living in these areas starts seriously increasing. Now, this is looking at Bayview to the north of Napier. And we can see there's a sort of a split in the model between those that head into central Bayview and those who travel to this isolated hill in the former lagoon area. Now, in practice, even for people on the southern part of Bayview, it's only very slightly further to go into central Bayview. But in central Bayview, there are a lot more in the way of shelter and facilities than there are up on this hill. So in practice, it may make sense for people to take the extra distance go into central Bayview. But within the model, it's a simple calculation where people just go to the quickest route, which in this case is taking them up on that. So I want to discuss some of the limitations of this model. So in this model, all the people are assumed to evacuate on foot, whereas in reality, some would drive or take a bike, and we know, unfortunately, some would not evacuate at all. Now, for the more built-up parts of town, there's a very strong reason why we want people to evacuate on foot, because if everybody gets into a car, it's just going to be a big traffic jam in that back road. Those who are able to make a timely evacuation on foot would do so. That would leave some room on the road for those who really have no choice because they're elderly or disabled, are not going to be able to get evacuated time on. In the models, people take the theoretically quickest route, whereas in practice, not all would know the quickest route. If the chosen route gets congested, people will not divert significantly. So agents have a fairly simple process. They decide which route they're going to go, and they more or less stick. Whereas in practice, if people have chosen a route, but then they come across a slow-moving crowd, those who know the area well may decide, oh, I'm not going to go this way with a big crowd. I'm going to go an alternative route. Not so many people. The model assumes that people move at their own purposeful walking speed, whereas in practice, families and groups are likely to walk together at the speed of the slowest member. Also have to be pauses for aftershocks. And the modeling of congestion is only approximate. It's broadly based on the width of the road or the path that people are walking on, and that is only approximately captured in the model. Importantly, our modeling that we're showing assumes that the roads and tracks are passable and normal. In practice, there could be debris that needs to be passed around. Liquefaction and landslides may block or hinder progress. Car traffic and abandoned cars may also need to be avoided. We assume that people are able to evacuate from their houses or workplaces quite promptly after an earthquake. So in this case, in about 5 minutes on average. Whereas in reality, there could be longer delays. People have been hurt or have difficulty finding clothes or want to secure their property against theft. And our simulated people disappear once they reach the edge of the evacuation zone. And in practice, it's very important for people to keep moving to make room for later arrivals. So this would be particularly true that for people coming up some of the steeper tracks on Napier Hill. So those tracks, evacuation zone boundary is often only part way up those tracks, but we need people to keep going because if people stop just as soon as they have passed the evacuation zone boundary, then it was going to cause problems for those who are coming behind. So we need people to keep moving. Now I'm going to show how the models look if we are simulating night, or more strictly speaking, outside of working hours. So this would also apply to basically people are other places. So in this case, we have considerably more people in the suburban parts of town, significantly fewer people in the town centre. So this changes both the total numbers of people evacuating and the parts of town that numbers going to different parts of town. So we may have fewer people coming up onto Bluff Hill town centre, but more coming into Napier South. West Shore has more people outside of working hours, so our problems with regard to getting across the Pandora Road Bridge are made more challenging. This is south of Napier at night time. Notice again we've got more people in the suburban part of the central areas, and these numbers are likely to increase with new development. And this makes the point I said earlier about trying to find routes across from the new development into the evacuation zone more important. And this is the Bayview area at nighttime. So again, this is a residential area primarily, so we have more people trying to evacuate outside. So just to summarize the differences between daytime and nighttime. In daytime, there are more people in the town center and the industrial parts of town. At night, there are more people in the residential suburbs. Overall, there are usually more people in the evacuation zone in the day, so about 15,000, than at night, where it's about 12,000. Now, I want to talk here about cruise ships, because when cruise ships come into Napier, it can significantly increase the number of people in the town center. So a large cruise ship can take around about 5,000 passengers, and on some days there may be 2 cruise ships in port. That's an extra 10,000 people in Napier. The extra visitors tend to be concentrated both within the main town center area and around the Ahuriri. So in this model, we see considerably more agents trying to evacuate from those parts of town, assuming that the cruise ship passengers are aware of the risk of tsunami and have some knowledge of what to do. In practice, there would be, I would expect, a mixture of amongst cruise ship passengers, but hopefully if they see local people evacuating to high ground or inland, they would follow suit. But we will have significantly more people on Napier Hill if we have the cruise ship passengers in town. These graphs are illustrating the effects of, well, the difference between daytime and nighttime and the effects of having a cruise ship in port. So on this axis, we have the time that has passed since the earthquake. And on this axis, we have the number of people who have reached safety by that time in our model. And bearing in mind, our target is really to get everybody evacuated by around 30 minutes. So this is looking at across the whole, all of here. And we see that at time we have around 12,000 people once everybody has evacuated. In daytime, it's around 15,000. And in daytime with tubes, it could have as many as 25,000 people to evacuate. And here we've broken this down a bit more by different suburbs to look at the effects, to get some feel for the numbers coming to different parts of town. So the effect of the extra cruise ship passengers is mostly felt in Napier South, Bluff Hill, Hospital Hill, although Bluff Hill is where this is most acute, as we go in daytime from around 3,000 to nearly 8,000 people on Bluff Hill. And if we compare that from nighttime, we have maybe around 800 up to 8,000 daytime with the cruise ship. That's a big range, very big spread in the number of people who might be trying to evacuate to Bluff Hill. And that raises questions about after the welfare of large numbers of people up on the hill. This slide shows some of the work we have in progress that is trying to combine the pedestrian evacuation with the movement of vehicles. And here we're looking at the north side of Napier, where we know there are significant challenges for people to evacuate everybody in a timely fashion on foot. So in this model, we have both pedestrians and vehicles. The pedestrians are the small black dots, whereas the vehicles are the larger red dots. We can see that the vehicles travel faster than the pedestrians. Now, this model needs some more work. We're aware of some things in it that are unrealistic. For one thing, the vehicles traveling along the highway, coming from Southern Bayview and Northern West Shore, are taking the shortest route to their isolated hill in the former lagoon area, which is probably unrealistic because it's only an extra couple of 100 meters to reach the Bayview town center. And when you're already driving along the highway, I think it makes sense that you would simply continue and come into the town center where there are more facilities. By the same token, our agents in West Shore, vehicles as well as pedestrians, are taking the shortest route, which brings them over the Pandora Road Bridge up to the Napier Hill. Whereas in practice, I think from Northern West Shore, and particularly for vehicles, it would very likely make sense to be using the highway bridge. It's both higher above the water, it's probably faster driving, and for vehicles, there'll be likely to be less with pedestrians. So that would make it easier too. There's an area that definitely needs more study. Perhaps some drill tests involving West Shore residents would be useful to try out different possibilities. From our modeling point of view, this is very much a work in progress. So, some final thoughts. The most key message here is long or strong gone. So, evacuation can only succeed if people actually heed that message and self-evacuate if they feel a long or strong earthquake. It's a good idea to think about where you could evacuate to, both from home and from work. And it's also good to have considered more than one option in case your first choice is blocked. Walk or bike if you can, and leave room on the roads for those who cannot. If everyone drives, there will be a big jam. And I'd just like to perhaps the value of using a bike because quite a lot quicker than walking, but it's much less likely to contribute or to jam than being a car. So if you can are able to ride it, could to be a good option. Cruise ship passengers may need guidance and will mostly go to Bluff and Hospital Hill, and there needs to be some thinking about their welfare because they could be large numbers. There's also this question mark: what is the best way to evacuate from West Shore? Biking, if that is an option for you. I think still an open question and needs more discussion with the community and perhaps doing some exercises to try out different options. And I'd just like to say credit to the rest of the research team who have contributed to this